How many bodies can you hide in plain sight before someone notices? What if the answer is 30? What if the hiding place is somewhere people visit every single day, somewhere essential to survival, somewhere so cold that time itself seems to stop? What if the keeper of that place smiled at customers while their loved ones lay frozen mere feet away, perfectly preserved, waiting in silence for 3 decades? Welcome to this journey into one of the most chilling cases of concealed murder in American history. But before we descend into the frozen darkness of this nightmare, I need you to ask yourself a question. What makes someone invisible? Poverty, isolation, the simple fact that no one cares enough to look. Because by the end of this account, you'll understand that the most terrifying disappearances aren't the ones that shock a nation. They're the ones that happen in absolute silence, where victims vanish and no one even notices they're gone. Tell us where you're watching from right now, and whether you believe the forgotten deserve justice as much as the famous, because this story will show you what happens when an entire community fails to see what's hidden right in front of them. This episode contains detailed descriptions of death, violence, and deeply disturbing historical events. We present these accounts with profound respect for those who suffered and died. This is not entertainment. This is testimony. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. In the municipal archives of Duluth, Minnesota, there exists a photograph that haunts everyone who sees it. It shows a simple ice house rough, hewn timber, heavy door, unremarkable in every way. But written on the back, in the precise hand of a police detective, are the words, "Recovery Site, 30 confirmed, God help us." Beneath that, a list of names, some with question marks, others that trail off into illegible script, as if the writer couldn't bear to continue. What you're about to discover is a mystery that consumed a small northern Minnesota community for 3 generations, where one man's methodical brutality created a frozen graveyard that existed for 30 years in the heart of a town, where victims were preserved so perfectly that when finally discovered, some looked as though they'd been dead for days rather than decades. This isn't just history. This is a question about visibility, about who matters and who doesn't, about how easy it is to hide atrocities when your victims are people society has already rendered invisible. It was the year 1923. America was entering the roaring 20s. Jazz filled the air, and Prohibition had just transformed the nation into a country of speakeasies and smugglers. But in the brutal cold of northern Minnesota, where winter descended like a physical punishment and lasted 6 months of the year, where temperatures could drop to 40 below zero and stay there for weeks, survival itself was a daily negotiation with death. And in that frozen landscape, in a town called Kettle Falls that most maps didn't bother to include, something unthinkable was beginning, a pattern of disappearance so gradual, so carefully executed, that it would continue undetected until 1953, leaving behind a legacy of horror that the community has never recovered from. This is the story of Magnus Andersen, the ice house keeper who smiled while he murdered. This is the story of 30 people who vanished into ice and silence. And this is the story of how an entire town failed to see the truth until it was frozen solid, preserved forever in the darkness. The thing about Kettle Falls, Minnesota, in the early decades of the 20th century is that it was a place where cold became a physical presence, not just weather, but an entity, a fact of existence so absolute that it shaped every aspect of life. Imagine winters where the thermometer didn't climb above zero for 3 straight months, where your breath crystallized instantly into ice particles that hung suspended in air so still it felt dead, where the sound of splitting trees, frozen wood cracking in the extreme temperatures echoed through the night like gunshots. Where darkness descended at 4 in the afternoon and didn't lift until nearly 9 in the morning, creating a world of perpetual twilight and shadow. The town itself was small, isolated, wedged between thick boreal forest and the frozen expanse of what locals called the Dead Lakes, a series of interconnected bodies of water that in winter became a vast white emptiness, indistinguishable from the surrounding snow-covered land. Population 347 in 1923, though that number fluctuated with the seasons as loggers came and went, as families fled south to escape another brutal winter, as tuberculosis and influenza and simple desperation thinned the ranks. The architecture reflected the cold's dominance. Buildings hunched low against the wind, constructed of thick timber and chinked with moss and mud. Windows were small, triple, paned when families could afford it, covered with oiled paper when they couldn't. Every structure seemed designed not to reach upward, but to burrow down, to hide from the relentless assault of winter. And central to this community's survival was ice, not the decorative ice of southern cocktails or the mere inconvenience of northern cities. This was ice as infrastructure, ice as economy, ice as the literal difference between eating and starving. Before electric refrigeration transformed American life, a change that wouldn't reach Kettle Falls until the late 1940s, ice harvesting was essential. Massive blocks cut from the Dead Lakes in deep winter, stored in insulated houses packed with sawdust, provided the only means of preserving food through the brief, intense summers when the same landscape that had been frozen solid became a swamp of mud and mosquitoes. The ice houses dotted the landscape like shrines to winter's power. Most were small, family operations, rough sheds where a dozen or two blocks lay slowly melting through the warmer months. But the town ice house, the commercial operation that served businesses and the wealthier families, was different. Larger, deeper, built partially underground where the permafrost created natural refrigeration even in July. And it was managed, maintained, and controlled by one man, Magnus Andersen. He arrived in Kettle Falls in the autumn of 1922, appearing out of the forest on foot, carrying a single worn canvas bag and wearing clothes that suggested he'd been traveling some time. He was 43 years old, though he looked older, his face weathered by exposure, his hands thick and scarred, his eyes a pale blue that seemed to reflect the ice he would soon manage. He spoke with a faint accent that the Swedish and Norwegian immigrants recognized as familiar, but couldn't quite place. Danish, perhaps, or from one of the more remote regions of Sweden where the old ways persisted. "I'm looking for work," he told Harold Moss, the general store owner and unofficial mayor of Kettle Falls. "Anything. I'm strong. I don't drink. I don't cause trouble." It was that simple. In a place where labor was always needed, where the population was fluid and rootless, where no one asked too many questions because everyone had something they were running from, Magnus Andersen was hired within the hour. The previous ice house keeper, a man named Thomas Larsen, had died suddenly that summer, found frozen to death in his own ice house in what had been ruled a tragic accident. Some kind of fall, the doctor speculated, that left him unconscious in the cold until hypothermia claimed him. The town needed someone to manage the ice operation before winter returned. Magnus had experience, he claimed. He'd worked ice in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in the northern reaches of Canada. He knew how to cut it, stack it, store it. He knew the art of insulation, the science of preservation. He was hired as the new ice house keeper, given the small cabin adjacent to the ice house as part of his compensation, and integrated into the community with the casual acceptance that characterized frontier life, What no one knew, what no one would discover for 30 years, was that Magnus Andersen had worked ice before, yes. But not in the way he claimed, not in the way anyone imagined. He had learned in those other places, those other ice houses, that ice preserves everything, that cold stops time, that the frozen dead can wait indefinitely for discovery. And he had learned something else, something that would define the next 3 decades, that some people are so invisible, so unnoticed, that they can vanish without anyone caring enough to look. The first winter Magnus managed the ice house was brutal, even by Kettle Falls standards. Temperatures plunged to 47 below zero. Snow accumulated in drifts higher than a man's head. The dead lakes froze to a depth of 4 feet, creating ice so thick that logging companies could drive teams of horses and fully loaded sleds across the surface without fear. Magnus proved to be exactly what he'd promised: reliable, hardworking, skilled. He organized crews of men to cut ice in precise blocks, each one measuring roughly 2 feet by 3 feet by 18 inches deep. The work was dangerous, exhausting, numbing in both the physical and psychological sense. Men stood on the frozen lake surface in temperatures that could cause frostbite in minutes, using specialized saws to cut through feet of ice, then iron tongs to lift the massive blocks, each weighing nearly 300 pounds, onto sleds that hauled them to the ice house. Magnus supervised it all with quiet efficiency. He never raised his voice, never showed frustration. He simply demonstrated what needed to be done, then watched with those pale eyes as the men followed his instructions. They packed each ice block with 6 inches of sawdust on all sides, creating insulation that would keep the ice frozen through summer's heat. The ice house filled methodically, level by level, until it held enough to serve the community for a full year. But Magnus built something else that winter, something the casual observer wouldn't notice. In the deepest section of the ice house, where the earthen walls met the wooden supports, where the permafrost created a zone of perpetual cold that even July couldn't touch, he constructed what he called the storage area for specialty items. He explained to the few who asked: meat that needs longer preservation, fish, things that can't risk any thawing. It made sense. No one questioned it, and no one noticed that this section had a separate door, one that Magnus kept locked. His key, his responsibility, his secret. The first person to disappear was a man named Samuel Oakes. He was 30, 2 years old, unmarried, a drifter who'd arrived in Kettle Falls that autumn looking for logging work. He had no family in town, no close friends, no roots. He lived in a boarding house run by a widow named Margaret Hall, paying weekly when he had money, sleeping on credit when he didn't. He drank heavily when he could afford to, and when he couldn't, he became irritable, aggressive, sometimes violent. On the night of February 14, 1920, Valentine's Day, though no one in Kettle Falls much celebrated such things, Samuel got into a fight at the boarding house. Margaret Hall would later testify that he'd been drinking, that he'd made unwanted advances, that when she rejected him, he'd become enraged. She'd ordered him out. He'd left, cursing, stumbling into the night without proper clothing, without even a coat. It was 38 below zero. No one saw Samuel Oakes again, but here's the thing about disappearances in places like Kettle Falls: they were common. Men wandered drunk into the cold and died of exposure. Bodies weren't found until spring thaw, if they were found at all. Animals scattered remains. The forest swallowed evidence. And for men like Samuel, rootless, troublesome, unloved, there was no one to demand answers, no one to organize searches, no one to care beyond a passing comment that he'd probably frozen to death somewhere in the woods. Magnus Andersen offered to help search. He joined the half-hearted effort that lasted precisely one day before the cold drove everyone back to their fires. He expressed appropriate concern. He suggested that Samuel had probably headed south, that drunks often got confused in the cold and wandered in wrong directions. "The forest is unforgiving," Magnus said, his voice carrying a sadness that seemed genuine. "We may never know what became of him." Everyone agreed. Everyone moved on. Everyone forgot. Everyone except Magnus, who 3 nights after Samuel's disappearance unlocked the special storage section of the ice house and spent several hours arranging sawdust, adjusting ice blocks, preparing the space for long-term preservation. If anyone had truly looked, they would have seen that one section of the ice house floor had been disturbed, that sawdust had been moved and replaced, that the careful organization Magnus maintained showed a subtle irregularity in one corner, but no one looked. Why would they? It was an ice house. Everything was supposed to be frozen, buried, stored away. Samuel Oakes became the first of 30. And Magnus Andersen, the quiet ice house keeper who never caused trouble, who smiled politely at customers, who attended church occasionally and paid his bills on time, had discovered something that would sustain him for 3 decades. In a place like Kettle Falls, among people the world had forgotten, you could hide victims in ice, and no one would ever think to look. The pattern emerged slowly, imperceptibly, like ice forming on a lake, invisible at first, then undeniable once you knew to look. Over the next 3 years, 6 more people vanished from Kettle Falls and the surrounding area. A trapper named William Hendricks, who'd come to town to sell furs and was last seen drinking at the general store. A woman named Elena Kowalski, who'd been traveling through on her way to visit family in Duluth and had stopped for the night at the boarding house. 2 loggers' brothers named Joseph and Frank Murphy, who'd gotten into debt at the company store and then simply disappeared. Their absence noted but not investigated because men who owed money often ran. A teenage boy named Christopher Paulson, 16 years old, who'd fought with his father and threatened to leave home. He'd stormed out into a March blizzard and never returned. The father, racked with guilt, searched for weeks. Magnus helped, of course. He was always willing to help. He organized search parties. He suggested places to look. He offered his ice house as a staging area where searchers could warm themselves and store supplies. "I pray we find him," Magnus told Christopher's father, placing a heavy hand on the grieving man's shoulder. "I pray he found shelter somewhere." They never found Christopher. The father died 2 years later, still consumed by guilt, never knowing that his son lay frozen beneath hundreds of pounds of ice, perfectly preserved, his 16-year-old face locked in an expression of terror that would remain unchanged for decades. And there was Mary Chen, a Chinese woman who'd come to Kettle Falls with her husband to open a laundry service. The marriage was troubled, violent. The husband drank. Mary worked 14-hour days and endured his fists in stoic silence. When she disappeared in the autumn of 1926, her husband claimed she'd run away, gone back to California where her family lived. No one investigated too deeply. Domestic situations were private matters. Chinese immigrants were a minority in Kettle Falls, already viewed with suspicion by some. Mary's husband left town within a month. The laundry closed, and everyone assumed the story ended there. But it didn't end. It froze, like everything else Magnus preserved. What's crucial to understand is that these disappearances didn't alarm anyone because they fit patterns people expected. Drifters drifted away. Troubled people ran from their problems. The unforgiving, cold claimed lives. This was frontier life, where death was common, and explanations were often assumptions rather than facts. Magnus understood this perfectly. He selected victims with the precision of a craftsman choosing materials. Never anyone with deep roots, never anyone whose absence would trigger serious investigation, never anyone who would be missed enough to warrant sustained attention. Always the marginal, always the vulnerable, always the invisible. And the ice house grew more crowded, level by level, body by body, while above them, the town went about its business, purchasing ice for their deliveries, their celebrations, their daily survival, never knowing they were supporting their own graveyard. But there was something else happening, something that wouldn't become clear until much later. Magnus wasn't just hiding bodies. He was preserving them with care that bordered on reverence. When the ice house was finally opened in 1953, when the truth emerged in all its frozen horror, investigators noted something strange. The bodies weren't simply dumped or hidden carelessly. They were positioned, arranged. Some were wrapped in canvas or cloth, others laid out as if sleeping. One investigator described it as almost tender, in the most disturbing way imaginable. Magnus Andersen, it seemed, wasn't just a killer hiding evidence. He was a collector, a preserver, someone who wanted to keep his victims exactly as they were at the moment of death. Forever young, forever frozen, forever his. The psychology of this wouldn't be fully explored until forensic psychiatry became more sophisticated. But even then, experts struggled to classify Magnus's motivations. He didn't fit the pattern of serial killers who sought power or sexual gratification. He didn't keep trophies in the traditional sense. He simply kept the bodies themselves, maintained them, visited them in the cold darkness of the ice house where time itself seemed suspended. And for 30 years he got away with it, because in Kettle Falls, Minnesota, the ice house was as much a part of the landscape as the frozen lakes, the endless forests, the brutal winters that defined existence. Who would think to question ice? By 1935, Magnus Andersen had become a fixture in Kettle Falls, as permanent and unremarkable as the ice house itself. He'd been managing the operation for 13 years. He attended community gatherings occasionally, though he was never the center of attention. He helped during emergencies, organizing volunteers when the logging camp caught fire in 1929, distributing food during the particularly harsh winter of 1931, when supply routes were cut off for 6 weeks. People described him as quiet, dependable, maybe a bit cold, the irony would later be noted, but fundamentally trustworthy. Children were slightly afraid of him, the way they might be afraid of any solitary older man, but he'd never been inappropriate or threatening. He simply existed on the periphery of community life, noticed but not examined, present but not fully seen. The disappearances had continued. By 1935, the count stood at 13 confirmed victims, though the word confirmed is misleading because none had been confirmed as victims. They were simply gone, vanished, assumed dead or departed. The list included Samuel Oakes, William Hendricks, Elena Kowalski, the Murphy brothers, Christopher Paulson, Mary Chen, a Cree trapper named Running Bear who'd come down from Canada to trade, an elderly woman named Harriet Voss, who'd been suffering from dementia and wandered from her daughter's home on a frigid January night, a railroad worker named Antonio Rossi, who'd gotten off at Kettle Falls by mistake and was never seen boarding another train, 3 more drifters whose names were unknown, whose faces were barely remembered, whose absences registered as barely a ripple in the community's consciousness. 13 people in 13 years, roughly 1 per year, though the distribution was irregular. Some years claimed no victims, other years saw multiple disappearances clustered together. And through it all, Magnus maintained the ice house with methodical precision, cutting blocks each winter, storing them with perfect insulation, selling them through summer, all while the bodies accumulated in the special storage section that no one but Magnus ever entered. But something shifted in 1935, something that nearly ended Magnus's operation before it could reach its full horrific scope. A county sheriff named Robert Thorne arrived in Kettle Falls. Thorne was different from the previous law enforcement presence in the area. A local deputy named Carl Johansson, who'd been more interested in keeping the peace than investigating crimes, who accepted explanations at face value and filed reports that justified minimal effort. Johansson had retired in '34, moving south to live with his daughter, and the county had assigned Thorne to cover the region. Robert Thorne was 47 years old, a career lawman who'd worked in Chicago before the corruption and violence there had driven him to seek quieter postings. But quieter didn't mean less thorough. Thorne believed in procedure, in documentation, in asking questions that made people uncomfortable. He'd been in Kettle Falls for less than 2 months when he began noticing patterns. "I've been reviewing old reports," he told Harold Moss one afternoon in April of '35, sitting in the general store with a stack of folders spread across the counter. "There's been a significant number of missing persons over the past decade." Moss shrugged, uncomfortable with the implication. "People come and go. You know how it is out here. Loggers move on, drifters drift. Winter claims some. It's the nature of this place. 13 people." Thorne said, his finger tracing down a list he'd compiled. 13 that I can document. Could be more that were never reported. That's higher than similar communities. We're isolated." Moss countered, "We get harder winters, more transients. What exactly are you suggesting, Sheriff?" Thorne looked up from his papers, his eyes sharp. "I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm noticing there's a difference." He began interviewing people, starting with the families and acquaintances of those who'd disappeared. He spoke with Christopher Paulson's mother, who'd never recovered from her son's vanishing. He tracked down Mary Chen's husband in California and conducted a lengthy telephone interview. He visited the logging camps and asked about the Murphy brothers. He reviewed weather records, trying to establish whether the disappearances correlated with particularly dangerous conditions. And inevitably, because the community was small and Magnus was one of its most consistent residents, Thorne spoke with the ice house keeper. "I understand you've helped with several searches over the years," Thorne said, sitting across from Magnus in the small cabin adjacent to the ice house. It was late afternoon, the spring sun creating long shadows, the smell of thawing earth mixing with the perpetual cold that radiated from the ice house structure. "When I can," Magnus replied, his voice as even as always. "It's my duty as a member of this community." "Did you know any of the missing personally?" "Some. Samuel Oakes lived at the boarding house when I first arrived. The Paulson boy I'd seen around town, the others." Magnus made a gesture of vague recognition. "This is a small place, Sheriff. You see everyone eventually." Thorne consulted his notes. "You've lived here longer than most. 13 years, according to Mr. Moss. That's unusual for Kettle Falls." "I like the quiet," Magnus said simply. "The work suits me. You ever notice anything unusual, anyone who seemed threatened, any conflicts that might explain these disappearances?" Magnus considered this with apparent seriousness. The Paulson boy fought with his father, that was known. Mary Chen's husband was violent, everyone knew that too. The drifters. He shrugged. "Who can say what troubles followed them? This is hard country, Sheriff. People run from things, people get lost. People make bad decisions in the cold and die for it. That's not mystery. That's just life here." Thorne nodded slowly, making notes. "You mind if I look around the ice house?" This was the moment. This was where Magnus's carefully constructed facade could have crumbled. A thorough search would have revealed irregularities, disturbed earth, the locked storage section that Magnus controlled. But Magnus didn't hesitate, didn't show the slightest concern. Of course not. He said, standing. Though there's not much to see, ice and sawdust. Not very interesting unless you're in the preservation business. He led Thorne through the ice house, explaining the operation with calm professionalism. He showed how the blocks were stacked, how the insulation worked, how the underground portion maintained cold even in summer. He demonstrated his record, keeping meticulous logs of ice cut, ice sold, inventory maintained. Everything was transparent, organized, legitimate. When they reached the locked storage area, Magnus produced his key without prompting. This section is for long-term storage, he explained. Meat, fish, things people want kept frozen for extended periods. He unlocked the door, revealing a space filled with wrapped packages, labeled containers, everything arranged with the same precision as the rest of the operation. Thorne stepped inside, his breath condensing in air that felt 20 degrees colder than the already frigid main chamber. He examined the labels, lifted a few packages, found exactly what Magnus claimed. Preserved food, stored for various townspeople who paid a small fee for the service. What Thorne couldn't see, what no one could see without literally dismantling the entire section, was that the floor beneath them was false. That beneath several feet of packed earth and sawdust, beneath ice blocks arranged to seem like ordinary storage, lay 13 bodies in various states of perfect preservation, some wrapped in same type of canvas and cloth as the legitimate stored goods, others simply laid out on shelves of ice that Magnus maintained like sacred relics. Thorne spent 15 minutes in the ice house. Then he thanked Magnus, shook his hand, and left, apparently satisfied that there was nothing suspicious about the operation. But Magnus knew he'd been close. One more probing question, one decision to dig deeper into the floor, one moment of intuition that something felt wrong, and the entire operation would have ended in 1935 with 13 victims instead of the 30 it would ultimately claim. That night, Magnus sat in his cabin and considered stopping. The risk had become real. Thorne was thorough, intelligent, suspicious. The smart move would be to cease, to let the frozen collection remain as it was, to simply manage the ice house legitimately and let the secret stay buried. But Magnus couldn't stop, because for him the preservation wasn't just about hiding evidence, it was the point itself. The collection, the maintenance of time suspended, the power of keeping these people exactly as they'd been, preventing decay, preventing the natural order of death and dissolution. He'd started because he believed he could get away with it. He continued because he needed it, in a way he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. So he adapted. He became more careful, more selective, more patient. The frequency of disappearances decreased. Where he'd averaged roughly 1 victim per year through the early period, he now extended the intervals, sometimes waiting 2 or 3 years between acquisitions. And Sheriff Thorne, finding no hard evidence, eventually stopped actively investigating the missing persons. His reports on file noted the unusual number, suggested continued vigilance, but without proof of foul play, without bodies, without witnesses, there was nothing to pursue beyond documentation. The case remained open but inactive. The disappearances were officially categorized as presumed dead due to environmental exposure or voluntary departure. And Magnus Andersen returned to his quiet routine, cutting ice in winter, selling it in summer, maintaining his collection in the frozen darkness where time had stopped, where his victims waited in perfect stasis, locked forever in the moment he'd chosen to preserve them. 17 more people would join them before the truth finally emerged. The years between 1935 and 1950 were arguably Magnus's most refined period. He'd learned from the close call with Sheriff Thorne. He'd developed a more sophisticated method of selection and preservation. And he'd begun to articulate, at least internally, the philosophy that drove him. In a diary discovered after his arrest, written in Danish and later translated, Magnus described his work in terms that mixed brutal pragmatism with something approaching spiritual justification. "The world forgets these people before they even die," he wrote in an entry from 1941. "They move through life as shadows, noticed by no one, mourned by no one. In the ice, I give them permanence. They become eternal, unchanging, perfect in their frozen state. Is this not a kind of mercy? Is this not better than being forgotten entirely, returned to dirt, scattered by animals, lost to time? In the ice, they matter, they exist, they are preserved." The psychology revealed in these writings fascinated forensic psychiatrists for decades. Magnus seemed to genuinely believe he was performing a service, that his victims were better off frozen and maintained than they would have been in their regular lives. He showed no remorse, no understanding that he'd ended lives that might have improved, changed, found meaning. In his view, he was rescuing people from insignificance by making them part of his collection. During this period, he took 16 more victims. A prostitute from Duluth named Sarah Winters, who'd come to Kettle Falls following a logging crew and had simply vanished after her clients moved on. A war veteran named Thomas Greer, who suffered from what we'd now call PTSD, who'd been living rough in the woods and came to town occasionally for supplies. An indigenous woman named Little Dove, whose family had been displaced by logging operations and who'd been working as a cleaner at the boarding house. Serve passionately. The list continued: transients, the troubled, the marginal, the forgotten. Always people whose absence could be explained away. Always people who fit the pattern of those who disappear into the wilderness, the cold, the anonymous expanse of northern Minnesota. But Magnus had refined his technique. He no longer acted impulsively. He observed potential victims for weeks or months, learning their patterns, their relationships, their vulnerabilities. He waited for opportunities when their disappearance would seem natural, expected, explicable. He created scenarios that provided cover, suggesting that Sarah Winters had mentioned moving to the next logging town, implying that Thomas Greer had talked about heading deeper into the wilderness, noting that Rebecca Moore had said she was going to try to reach family in Wisconsin, and the preservation process itself became more elaborate. Magnus studied refrigeration techniques as they evolved. He experimented with different methods of storage, different arrangements, different ways to maintain the bodies in optimal condition. When electrical refrigeration finally reached Kettle Falls in 1948, allowing for more controlled temperatures, Magnus was one of the first to advocate for upgrading the ice house with supplemental cooling systems, ostensibly to improve the commercial operation, but actually to better preserve his collection. By 1950, the count stood at 20, 9 victims spanning 27 years. And Magnus was 60, 9 years old, beginning to feel his age, beginning to worry about what would happen to his collection when he died. He'd never considered getting caught. The possibility genuinely seemed remote to him, even impossible. He'd been doing this for nearly 3 decades without arousing serious suspicion. Sheriff Thorne had retired in '46 and been replaced by a younger man who showed no interest in reviewing old cases. The disappearances were accepted as part of life in a harsh, remote place. Magnus had become such a fixture that questioning him seemed as absurd as questioning the lakes themselves. But what haunted Magnus in his old age wasn't fear of discovery. It was fear of time. The ice preserved his victims, but it couldn't preserve him. He was mortal. Eventually, he would die, and what would happen then? Would his collection be discovered by whoever took over the ice house? Would they understand what he'd done, the care he'd taken, the permanence he'd created? Or would they simply see bodies and horror, unable to appreciate the philosophical dimension of preservation? These worries consumed him through 1950 and into 51. He became more withdrawn, more obsessive about maintaining the ice house, more resistant to anyone else entering the storage section. When Harold Moss suggested that Magnus should train an assistant, someone who could eventually take over the operation, Magnus refused with uncharacteristic vehemence. "The ice house is my responsibility," he said flatly. "I'll manage it as long as I'm able. After that." He trailed off, the implication clear that he hadn't thought beyond his own tenure. But age was making him careless in small ways. He forgot to lock the storage section door on 2 occasions. He became less precise in his record keeping. His movements were slower, his attention less sharp. The perfect control he'd maintained for decades was beginning to slip, and he knew it. And then, in the autumn of 1952, Magnus made his final acquisition. Her name was Alice Brennan. She was 20, 3 years old, a schoolteacher who'd come to Kettle Falls to work at the small schoolhouse that served the community's children. She was beloved by her students, respected by the families, engaged to be married to a young man in Duluth who planned to move to Kettle Falls the following spring. She was, in other words, exactly the kind of victim Magnus had always avoided: visible, connected, someone whose absence would be noticed, questioned, investigated. But Magnus was tired. He was old. And Alice Brennan was beautiful in a way that called to something deep in his psychology: the desire to preserve perfection, to capture beauty at its peak and hold it forever against the ravages of time. On the night of October 17, 1952, Alice stayed late at the schoolhouse preparing lessons. Magnus, who'd been watching her for weeks, approached with an offer to help carry supplies. She accepted, grateful for assistance. They walked together through the early autumn darkness, Alice talking cheerfully about her students, Magnus listening with apparent interest. What happened in the darkness between the schoolhouse and the ice house has never been fully established. The forensic evidence suggested strangulation, rapid and efficient. Alice Brennan died without the opportunity to scream, without leaving any evidence of struggle, without any chance to understand why the quiet ice housekeeper, who'd always been kind to her students, had suddenly become her murderer. And Magnus, for the last time, opened the storage section and added a body to his collection, arranging Alice with particular care, positioning her among the other frozen victims like a prized acquisition in a museum of death. But this time, people noticed. This time, the entire community mobilized. This time, the absence wasn't something that could be explained away with theories about drifting or environmental exposure or voluntary departure. Alice Brennan was missing, and Kettle Falls demanded answers. The search began within hours of her failure to return home. Volunteers combed the woods, the streets, every building in town. Her fiancé drove up from Duluth in a panic, organizing search parties, offering rewards, demanding that authorities treat this as the crisis it was. Sheriff John Marshall Thorne's replacement brought in state investigators. They interviewed everyone, examined everything, pursued every lead. And Magnus helped. Of course he helped. He joined the searches. He expressed concern. He opened the ice house to be used as a staging area, just as he'd done for so many other searches over the years. "I pray we find her safe," he told Alice's fiancé, the same words he'd said to Christopher Paulson's father decades earlier. "She's a wonderful teacher. The children love her." But this time, someone was paying closer attention. Sheriff Marshall had spent the past year reviewing old files, familiarizing himself with the county's history. He'd noticed the same patterns Robert Thorne had noticed: the unusual number of missing persons, the absence of bodies, the way disappearances seemed to cluster around Kettle Falls despite similar communities having far fewer incidents. And when Alice Brennan vanished, Marshall's instincts told him this wasn't about the woods or the cold or voluntary flight. This was about something else, something deliberate, something local. On the third day of the search, Marshall stood in the ice house, ostensibly coordinating volunteers but actually observing. Watching Magnus, noticing how the old man moved through the space, how he seemed to avoid certain areas, how his eyes kept drifting to the locked storage section. "That's the long-term storage?" Marshall asked, nodding toward the locked door. "Yes," Magnus replied, his voice still calm but something flickering behind his eyes. "For meat and fish, things that need extra preservation. Mind if I look?" This was the second time a sheriff had asked that question. But this time was different. This time, Magnus hesitated for just a fraction of a second. This time, his hand trembled slightly as he reached for the key. This time, something in his demeanor shifted, and Marshall, trained to read people, alert for deception, noticed. "Of course," Magnus said, but the words came out wrong, too quick, too defensive. He unlocked the door. Marshall stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping across the familiar scene of wrapped packages, labeled containers, everything apparently legitimate. But Marshall had brought someone with him, a state investigator named Thomas Kerrigan, who'd worked fraud cases in Minneapolis and had developed an eye for things that appeared too perfect, too carefully arranged. "This is very organized," Kerrigan observed, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "How long have you been maintaining this system?" 29 years, Magnus said, and even as the words left his mouth, he realized his mistake. 29 years is a long time, Kerrigan said softly. "Long time to maintain such precise organization. Long time to keep track of everything stored here." He began examining the labels more closely, referencing them with a list of current residents. Some made sense: families who'd paid for storage. But others referenced names that Kerrigan didn't recognize, names that seemed outdated, packages that had supposedly been here for years but showed no signs of degradation or retrieval. "Who's Samuel Oakes?" Kerrigan asked, holding up a package with that name on the label. Magnus's face went pale. "A man who lived here years ago. He must have stored something and never retrieved it. When exactly? I don't recall precisely. 1923, perhaps 24. And you've maintained his storage for 30 years without payment." Sometimes people don't come back. I keep things in case they return." It was a weak explanation, and everyone in that frozen room knew it. Kerrigan set the package down carefully and turned to Marshall. "I think we need to conduct a more thorough examination of this facility," he said formally. "I'm requesting a warrant to excavate and examine everything in this storage section." Magnus stood very still. 30 years of perfect control, 3 decades of meticulous preservation, hundreds of days spent maintaining his frozen collection. All of it was collapsing in real time. He could see it happening, could feel the inevitability like ice cracking beneath his feet. And for the first time in his life, Magnus Andersen understood that time had finally caught up to him. "There's no need for that," he said quietly. "I'll show you." And he did. The excavation of Magnus Andersen's ice house took 6 days. What emerged from that frozen darkness shocked even hardened investigators who'd seen their share of death. 30 bodies in various states of preservation, ranging from Alice Brennan, who'd been dead less than a week and looked as though she might wake if someone called her name, to Samuel Oakes, who'd been frozen for 29 years but remained identifiable, his features locked in the same expression of terror he'd worn when Magnus had strangled him on that February night in 1923. The bodies were arranged with disturbing care. Some lay on shelves carved from ice, positioned as if sleeping. Others were wrapped in canvas or heavy cloth, bundled like precious cargo. A few were dressed in clothing that wasn't theirs, outfits Magnus had apparently selected for them, creating poses or presentations that suggested some internal logic only he understood. The temperature in the storage section had been maintained at precisely 14 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to prevent decomposition, but not so cold as to cause severe ice crystal damage to tissues. Magnus had been rotating air flow, adjusting humidity, monitoring the bodies with the same care most people gave to prize livestock or valuable inventory. Forensic pathologists brought in from Minneapolis and Chicago worked in shifts, documenting each victim, photographing the scene, collecting evidence. They'd never seen anything like it. A mass grave where the dead hadn't decayed, where time had stopped, where victims from 3 decades remained present and visible in a way that made the horror immediate rather than historical. It's like Pompeii, one pathologist remarked, though he immediately regretted the comparison. These weren't people caught by natural disaster. These were victims of methodical, sustained murder, preserved by their killer with something approaching reverence. The identification process was painstaking. Some victims were easy: Alice Brennan, Christopher Paulson, Mary Chen, others who'd been documented in missing persons reports. But many had never been reported missing at all. They required dental records, personal effects, eventually DNA testing in later decades as technology advanced. Even with all available resources, 3 bodies were never definitively identified. They remain, even now, as unknown male 1, unknown female 2, and unknown male 3 in the official records. Each identification reopened old wounds. Christopher Paulson's mother, now in her 70s, learned that her son hadn't run away, hadn't frozen in the woods, hadn't abandoned her. He'd been murdered and stored like meat, preserved in ice for 19 years while she died slowly of guilt and grief. She attended the trial every day, staring at Magnus with an expression that witnesses described as beyond hatred, beyond anger, simply incomprehending, as if she couldn't process how any human could do what he'd done. Mary Chen's family flew in from California, seeing her body for the first time since she'd left to marry the man who beat her. Her younger sister testified at the trial about how Mary had written letters describing her fear, her isolation, her hopelessness. She was trying to save money to come home. The sister said through tears she just needed a little more time, and he took that from her. Alice Brennan's fiancé attended the exhumation, insisting on being present when they brought her out of the ice house. Witnesses said he stood silently as they carried her body past, his hand outstretched as if to touch her, then falling away when he realized she was frozen solid, that even her face was covered in frost, that the beautiful woman he'd loved was now just another artifact in Magnus's collection. The community of Kettle Falls went into a kind of shock. This had happened in their town, under their feet, for 30 years. They'd purchased ice from Magnus, they'd smiled at him on the street, they'd accepted him as one of their own. And all the while, he'd been murdering their most vulnerable and storing them in frozen darkness. The guilt was collective and crushing. Why hadn't they noticed? Why hadn't the disappearances alarmed them more? Why had they been so willing to accept easy explanations about drifters and winter and the harsh nature of life in the North? Some residents defended themselves by pointing out the difficulty of seeing patterns when you're inside them, the way normalcy bias prevents people from recognizing horror when it develops gradually. Others simply couldn't reconcile their memories of quiet, helpful Magnus with the monster the evidence revealed. The ice house itself became a source of fear and revulsion. People refused to go near it. Children had nightmares about the frozen bodies. The building was burned on May 7, 1953, with the entire town watching, as if fire could purify what ice had corrupted. But the smell of burning timber mixed with the still, frozen earth created a stench that lingered for weeks, and people said the smoke that rose from the conflagration was the wrong color, tinged with something they didn't want to identify. Magnus Andersen's trial began on September 2, 1953, in the county courthouse in Duluth, Minnesota. It lasted 7 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming physical evidence. 30 bodies, meticulous records Magnus had kept in Danish detailing each victim's acquisition, date, and preservation status, witness testimony about Magnus's access to victims and his presence around the times of disappearances, and forensic evidence tying him to multiple murders. But what transfixed the public wasn't the evidence. Everyone knew Magnus was guilty. What fascinated and horrified people was Magnus himself, specifically his complete lack of remorse and his apparent inability to understand why what he'd done was wrong. When asked if he felt sorry for his victims, Magnus responded, "Sorry, I preserved them. I kept them from being forgotten. Without me, they would have died anyway and returned to dirt, scattered. Meaningless, in the ice, they have permanence. They're dead." The prosecutor pointed out, "You killed them. Death comes for everyone." Magnus replied calmly, "I simply controlled the when and how, and then I ensured they wouldn't decay, wouldn't be lost. Is that not a gift?" His attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named David Winters, who later admitted the case gave him nightmares for decades, attempted an insanity defense. Multiple psychiatrists examined Magnus, all reaching similar conclusions. He was completely sane by legal standards. He understood right from wrong, knew that society considered murder illegal, was fully aware that he'd hidden his actions because others would disapprove. What Magnus had was not insanity, but a fundamentally different moral framework, one where preservation justified killing, where permanence was more important than life, where his victims' invisibility in life made them perfect candidates for his collection. "I only chose those who wouldn't be missed." He explained matter of factly during testimony. "Those who were already forgotten, I gave them significance." Like Alice Brennan, the prosecutor asked, his voice sharp. A beloved teacher, engaged to be married, loved by her students. She was forgotten. For the first time, Magnus showed something approaching emotion, not remorse, but frustration, as if the prosecutor was being deliberately obtuse. Alice was different, he admitted. Alice was beautiful. She deserved to be preserved at her most perfect moment. In 10 years, 20 years, she would have aged, declined, lost that perfection. I stopped time for her. I kept her exactly as she was. The courtroom erupted in shouts of anger and disgust. Alice's fiancé had to be physically restrained from attacking Magnus. The judge called multiple recesses, but Magnus simply sat calmly, genuinely confused about why people were upset. He'd given Alice immortality, in his view. He'd ensured she'd never grow old, never decline, never face the indignities of time. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on 30 counts of first-degree murder. At sentencing, the judge, a man named Harold Peterson, who'd presided over hundreds of cases in his career, addressed Magnus directly. "I have sentenced murderers, rapists, criminals of every description, but in 30 years on this bench, I have never encountered anyone quite like you, Mr. Andersen. Not because of the number of your victims, though 30 is horrifying. Not because of the methods, though freezing people while they're still identifiable is uniquely disturbing, but because you genuinely seem to believe you did nothing wrong. You show no remorse, no understanding of the lives you stole, the families you destroyed, the basic human right to life that you violated 30 times. You talk about preservation as if it's noble. But you weren't preserving people, Mr. Andersen. You were preserving corpses. You weren't giving them permanence. You were stealing their futures. Every one of those victims had the potential for more life, for change, for joy, for love, for all the things that make existence meaningful. And you took that from them so you could collect them like specimens, like objects, like things rather than human beings. I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole on each count, sentences to run consecutively. Though given your age, this is largely symbolic. You will die in prison regardless. But I want it on the record that if you lived 1,000 years, you would serve every day for what you've done." Magnus Andersen was 70 years old at sentencing. He was transferred to Stillwater Prison, where he was kept in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes. Other inmates, even hardened criminals, were horrified by his case. There were multiple attempts on his life in the first year. He lived for 7 more years, dying of natural causes on March 14, 1960, at the age of 77. His last words, according to the prison chaplain, were, "The ice never forgets. They're still perfect. They'll always be perfect." His body was cremated. No one claimed the ashes. The aftermath of Magnus Andersen's case rippled through American culture for decades. The town of Kettle Falls never recovered. By 1960, the population had dropped to less than 100. People couldn't live in a place so associated with horror. Families moved away, businesses closed. The logging industry that had sustained the community declined anyway as forests were depleted, but the ice house killings accelerated the town's death. By 1970, Kettle Falls was officially abandoned. Today, it's a ghost town, accessible only by rough forest roads, visited occasionally by dark tourism enthusiasts and researchers studying the case. The site of the ice house is marked only by a depression in the earth and some weathered foundation stones. No memorial stands there. The victims' families specifically requested that nothing be built. They wanted the place forgotten, wanted the earth to reclaim it and erase the memory of what happened there. But the memory persists. The case became a touchstone in criminology, studied for what it revealed about victim selection, about how certain populations remain vulnerable precisely because they are invisible. Magnus's victims were disproportionately poor, transient, marginalized, the exact people society was already failing to protect. The case also sparked discussions about missing persons investigations, about how disappearances in rural, isolated communities often received less attention than those in urban areas, about how assumptions about natural deaths in harsh environments could mask murder. Several of the victims were buried with proper funerals decades after their deaths. Christopher Paulson was finally laid to rest beside his mother, who died still believing he'd run away. Mary Chen was cremated, and her ashes were scattered in California by her family, who said they wanted her to finally come home. Alice Brennan was buried in Duluth beside the plot reserved for the man who'd wanted to marry her. He never married anyone else and was eventually buried beside her when he died in 1987. The three unidentified victims received simple markers in a cemetery in Duluth, paid for by a fund established by Gill, ridden residents of Kettle Falls. The markers read, "Unknown but not forgotten, victim of Magnus Andersen, found 1953." In the decades since, forensic genealogy has made several attempts to identify these last three victims, but without success. They remain anonymous, their lives and stories lost, known only as numbers in a case file and bodies in photographs that are sealed in archives, accessible only to researchers with specific permissions. But there's one more piece to this story, one final disturbing detail that emerged only in 2019 when a team of historians and forensic anthropologists conducted a comprehensive review of the case. They discovered something that Magnus's original trial had missed, something that changed the understanding of when his killing actually began. In the section of the ice house where Samuel Oakes had been found, the very first victim, frozen since 1920, three investigators in 2019 noticed irregularities in the foundation beneath where the body had lain. Using ground-penetrating radar not available in the 1950s, they detected voids, spaces that suggested additional excavation. With permission from the state and surviving family members, they conducted a careful archaeological dig of the site. And they found three more bodies. These victims predated Magnus's arrival in Kettle Falls. They'd been buried beneath the ice house foundation, likely placed there between 1918 and 1920, before the ice house had even been built, suggesting that the previous keeper, Thomas Larsen, had also been using the location to hide bodies. All three remains were so degraded that identification was impossible. But forensic analysis suggested they'd been buried approximately 5 to 10 years before Magnus arrived, meaning the ice house had been a murder site before Magnus ever touched it. This discovery raised horrifying questions. Had Larsen been a killer too? Had Magnus somehow known this, perhaps discovered evidence when he took over the operation and been inspired by it? Or was the ice house itself somehow cursed, attracting men who found the cold an irresistible tool for preservation? The full truth died with Magnus and Larsen. But the discovery meant that the ice house killings spanned not 30 years but potentially 40 or more, with a victim count not of 30 but 33, or possibly higher if Larsen had other victims who were never found. The site was excavated completely in 2020, with multiple archaeological and forensic teams working for months to ensure no other remains were hidden in the frozen earth. None were found, but the teams noted that permafrost patterns suggested areas that would have been perfect for concealment, raising the possibility that bodies might still be out there, locked in ice, waiting. The Kettle Falls Ice House remains one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in American history, not just for its scope, but for what it revealed about invisibility, about who matters and who doesn't, about how easy it is to hide atrocities when victims are people society has already rendered unseen. The story of Magnus Andersen and his frozen graveyard asks us questions that don't have comfortable answers. How many people disappear every year, not into dramatic crimes that capture national attention, but into simple absence, into the gaps between communities, into the cold spaces where no one is looking? According to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, there are currently over 600,000 active missing persons cases in the United States. Most will be found, but thousands won't. Thousands will become names in databases, photographs on websites, people whose absences create ripples that eventually flatten, leaving nothing but questions that slowly stopped being asked. Magnus Andersen's victims were largely people who'd already been rendered invisible by poverty, by transience, by mental illness, by being immigrants in a time and place that didn't value their lives. Their disappearances were accepted because accepting them was easier than investigating, because looking closely might have required admitting that the community was failing its most vulnerable members, because questioning the icehouse keeper, reliable, helpful Magnus would have disrupted the comfortable narrative that everything was normal, that disappearances were just a natural feature of life in a harsh place, but they weren't natural, they were murders. 33 people at minimum, possibly more, stolen from whatever futures they might have had and frozen in place to satisfy one man's twisted philosophy about preservation and significance. The ice preserved them physically, but it couldn't preserve what mattered: their potential, their humanity, their right to continue existing and changing and growing older and making choices. Magnus stole all of that, and he did it for 30 years because no one cared enough about his victims to look closely at their disappearances. That's the real horror of this case, not the bodies in the ice, disturbing as they are, but the collective failure that allowed those bodies to accumulate year after year, while an entire community went about its business, buying ice from a murderer, trusting him, accepting him, never noticing that their most vulnerable were vanishing into his collection. To this day, in what's left of Kettle Falls, a handful of collapsed buildings slowly being reclaimed by forest people report strange phenomena on the coldest winter nights. Sounds like breathing coming from beneath the snow, shadows moving between the trees where the ice house once stood, a persistent cold spot that remains frozen even when surrounding areas have thawed. Most dismiss these as legend, as the mind's tendency to create narrative from natural phenomena, as the way guilt and horror congeal into ghost stories. But some know better. Some understand that certain truths remain frozen in place, preserved like Magnus's victims, waiting in the cold darkness to be acknowledged. And on the anniversary of the ice house discovery, May 2nd, a small group still gathers at the Duluth Cemetery where the unknown victims are buried. They bring flowers. They stand in silence. They remember 3 people whose names were lost but whose deaths matter, whose lives mattered, who deserved better than to be invisible, better than to be forgotten, better than to become numbers in the collection of a man who confused preservation with immortality. If this journey through the frozen darkness of Kettle Falls resonated with you, if you find yourself disturbed by the ease with which Magnus Andersen hid 33 murders simply by choosing victims no one would miss, then this channel has more truths waiting in the shadows. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the uncomfortable questions about who we see and who we overlook, about whose disappearances we investigate and whose we accept. Leave a like if this account provoked something deeper than entertainment, if it made you question how many people in your own community are invisible, how many could disappear without anyone raising the alarm, how many modern Magnus Andersens might be hiding atrocities in plain sight because their victims are people we've collectively agreed don't matter enough to notice. And in the comments, I want to know, if you'd been in Kettle Falls during those 30 years, do you honestly believe you would have questioned Magnus? Would you have noticed the pattern of disappearances? Would you have insisted on investigating when authorities were ready to accept easy explanations? Or would you, like everyone else in that community, have found it easier to believe that drifters drift, that troubled people run, that winter claims lives, that everything was normal because abnormal requires action and action is difficult? The most disturbing answer might be that most of us would have looked away. That most of us do look away every day from the vulnerable people in our communities whose absences wouldn't raise alarms, whose disappearances would be explained away, whose invisibility makes them perfect victims. Until next time, remember the ice preserves everything except innocence. And sometimes, the coldest place isn't a frozen graveyard in Minnesota. It's the part of ourselves that finds it easier to accept comfortable lies than uncomfortable truths. The bodies are gone now, the ice house is ashes and memory, but the questions remain, frozen in time, waiting for each generation to answer. Who do we see? Who do we overlook? And what horrors become possible when we stop noticing the people at the margins? Magnus Andersen knew the answer. We should too.